Just a very quick story about Rosie Ruiz. It was a huge story.
Rosie Ruiz today denied that she cheated to become the women's winner in Monday's Boston Marathon. But she faced tough questioning from critics who believe she may have given new meaning to the biblical observation, the race is not to the swift.
She never planned it. This was a plan that went awry.
We do have grave doubts.
In 1980, this woman was declared the winner of the Boston Marathon. Then, just over a week later, stripped of this title when it was declared that she had cheated and, in fact, had only run the very last mile of the race. I wanted to know why. Why did she do this? Well, to understand, we need to go back a few years to set the scene, to the 1970s, starting with a man by the name of Bill Rodgers.
JOG ON did not exist back then.
Right at the heart of the distance running boom, Bill Rodgers, a great American runner, when he was at college.
His college roommate was the 1968 winner of the Boston Marathon, Andy Burfoot.
Burfoot won Boston in 68, but then never cracked on from there. He got 2:14 at Fukuoka, and Bill was on the whiskey.
He was smoking
cigarettes and stuff, and he
riding around Boston on a motorcycle, and he saw a bunch of guys that he used to run with. He said, maybe I should get back into that.
Went out for a jog the next day.
And next thing you know, wins the Boston Marathon in 1975, an American record.
And he became one of the greatest modern-day running heroes of all time. Amazing.
I met him in 76. I was a weekend newsman at a radio station in town. And then I asked my news director at the 77 Boston Marathon, let me cover the marathon. I know Bill. In May of 1977, I began a radio show in Boston called The Runner's Digest. And that was a 1-hour weekly radio talk show about running.
It must have been a nice change to have moved across from that politics to something that you actually were discovering a passion for.
Absolutely. You really did feel at that time and at that place that you were onto something special.
Some marathons are slightly forgettable, but others are intriguing, especially in the 1980s when everything came together.
But Boston in the late 1970s, with especially Billy winning 4 Bostons and 4 New Yorks.
Won Boston and New York 4 times each.
Really the king of the roads, #1 man in the world.
And he could just do those 140 miles a week, and he would love it. He was a dreamer. He would just get lost in his own little world. He would float along, never break down.
It really was the epicenter of the running boom.
Then, on April 21st, 1980, something happened that no one was expecting.
I was with Gail Barron, the 1978 Boston Marathon champion, working for WGBH, the PBS public broadcasting station in Boston. And Gail and I, we were at the halfway mark. And that's where we were reporting from, and I still have that tape.
Right now, we have Jacqueline Giroux from Montreal in the lead. Right behind her, maybe 50 yards, Ellison Goodall.
That's how we knew that Jackie Giroux was in the lead. And we were anticipating a fairly hotly contested race in the second half, especially over the Newton Hills. And so when all of a sudden this other person showed up at the finish line, we just sort of said, well, she's not real.
Was it an instantaneous, this doesn't make any sense?
You could instantly tell she wasn't real. First of all, it was a hot day.
Very hot day. It was nearly 80 degrees that day.
Sunshine. Boston is a notoriously uncovered course. Rosie, first of all, was heavy gauge material.
She runs in a very heavy T-shirt.
If you ran the first mile of the race, you'd be drenched in sweat.
With no sweat patterns or anything like that.
She had no sweat on. Her hair wasn't sweaty, and she ran a course record by 3 minutes. And so you add all that up, and you're saying, come on. It never dawned on us that anyone would be cheating. The problem is that they knee-jerked the wreath.
She's given the laurel wreath.
And the medal.
She's given a medal with a big diamond star.
Yes. And if they just would have waited 5 minutes, the word would have come down that she wasn't real.
At the end of a very, very difficult, long day of that day, at about midnight, Will Cockerell, the director, says, there were serious questions about the identity of the woman's winner. He was asked, do you call this woman a liar and a cheat? And he goes, those are 2 words I would never use to describe another human being. We do have grave doubts.
So they had to go through due diligence. We're going to bend over backwards to make sure that all our bases are covered.
And then they just took a week.
A week?
They analysed 100,000 photographs of the race.
Thousands and thousands of photographs and, all the interviews in the world.
Of course she never showed up.
And of course it was the fait accompli that she had not done it, but they wanted to protect themselves.
Because you've got to tread carefully.
Perhaps arguably one of the biggest victims out of all of this was Jackie Giroux herself, who would have had the wreath on her head that day.
They continued to rob Jackie Giroux of the honor which she had richly earned but never really received. In many ways, though, it was the biggest moment of her running career.
It's just the moment of a lifetime.
And it got taken away from her.
Stolen from her.
Up until that final mile, everyone kept talking, cheering.
Boss lady, boss woman.
You're the first woman, you're the first woman. Then all of a sudden, with a mile to go,
the crowds go silent.
They weren't saying it anymore.
And somebody goes, second woman!
You're number 2.
She crossed the line and there's nobody to greet her. There's no ribbon. Wow. And there are no policemen, there's no laurel wreath. And she knew she was first. Of course she did. You're going to see another woman, aren't you?
Yeah, so even as she's coming in, before she even sees, she knows something's not quite right, something's amiss. It's a very romantic idea that some unknown has discovered this talent and has somehow got, it's a nice idea.
The word to describe her running was lumbering. Runners, you can see smooth rhythm. You see this cadence. You see someone who's efficient in their stride, especially at the marathon level. And this woman was, lumbering. She wasn't running even 8-minute pace when she was coming down that final 200 meters, which means she must have been on 2:25 pace in order to die off at this pace. And you looked at her and you said, well, she couldn't do any of that. She couldn't have run a mile at course record pace.
But the question remains, how did this happen? And why did she do it?
She never planned it. This was the plan that went awry.
She was an office clerk in New York.
And what happened was she entered the New York City Marathon the previous fall. And there's been evidence and testimony to prove she dropped out of that race.
She rode the subway at the New York Marathon.
They found the woman she was on the subway with, who basically testified.
Got across the finish line and was given a super time of about 2:55.
Well, the next day at work,
everyone in her office was, wow.
Oh my God, Rosie. Oh my God, congratulations. I'll tell you what, you did so well.
Qualifies her for Boston.
You qualified for the Boston Marathon.
And they say, see if you can go quicker.
We'll pay for you to go to Boston.
And her office fly her up there and give her a hotel. And they're really proud of her, but she's not a runner.
Now what do I do? Okay, well, I'll just do what I did in New York.
And so she's in Kenmore Square, a mile from the finish line, and sees a couple of hundred men go by, and has been standing there quite a while and thinks, I think I need to get in here, otherwise my boss is going to say, what the hell were you doing?
Except she mistimed it.
She hops in, and people see her kind of falling, stumbling into the runners, almost like a joke, and she crosses the line in 2:31, smashing the American record.
She just went out in the crowd too soon.
Of course she didn't expect to win or mean to win.
She didn't plan on being number 1. It just turned out that way.
And do you think that was the main motivation, was because of this original pressure that came from her work, her office, and taking her from New York and all these eyes on her?
That's what it was. She wasn't going to be able to live up to what she had been given credit for in New York City.
But after crossing the line, it was the interview with Catherine Switzer that really raised suspicion to another level.
She couldn't pull off once the microphones and cameras were in her face.
She's thrown into an interview with Catherine Switzer.
She was fully unprepared for that interview, and I think in that interview you see a lot.
Right, exactly. And it wasn't that she was oxygen depleted. It wasn't that she was deep in the well from having gone through a marathon experience.
And Switzer's asking her,
have you been doing a lot of heavy intervals? I'm not sure what intervals are.
I mean, when somebody says, well, what's an interval?
Yeah.
Well, it's the thing you do every week.
Somebody asked me that. What's an interval? And
every time you ask a question, you're just expecting some semblance of a correct answer, and it just never came around. The eyeball test, the smell test, she didn't do it just from that standpoint. Everywhere along the line, your eyes, your ears, your nose, every sense you had told you that she didn't do what she claims to have done. And Catherine Switzer, who was covering the women's race, rode the entire way in front. We met up afterwards, and she says, well, that didn't happen. And Jock Semple, again, Jock and I were talking afterwards. He says, it's a disgrace. It's a disgrace. Jock was always a very, very animated guy, and he knew instantly. Will Cloney knew instantly. Catherine and myself and Bill Rodgers. And then he finally, at some point, Billy got her alone and tried to say, listen, he was trying to be the good guy, trying to help her do the right thing.
And she went back to her office job in New York.
She still wouldn't do it. She wouldn't cop to it.
Why do you think that is? Because even in those 8 days, obviously there's multiple opportunities for her to step up and say, look, guys, I got into a weird situation. I'm very sorry. Till her death, she never came out and admitted it. Why do you think that is? Did she just get too deep into the lie?
When a lie gets a bit too much, it's impossible to come. It's so difficult to come clean. And she died quite recently, and she never did come clean.
It's not unique. I think she's pathological. I think she was a troubled person.
And her life was never the same again. It was a huge story.
It was a sad story.
And do you think possibly Ruiz could have had a better life had she just said, look, this is the situation I got into?
Intergalactically, it's a tragedy.
She wasn't a mean person.
She didn't mean to.
She got caught into something that was much larger than her ability to handle, and she didn't know how to handle it. But still, she's intriguing. What an intriguing character.
I don't think she had much of a life, sadly.
But she was a troubled person before this incident. She was a troubled person after this incident. This was just the pinnacle of her troubles within a troubled life.
JOG ON is a channel that releases running-themed videos. If you would like to help us out, hit subscribe and share this video with someone who may also enjoy it. I'll leave you with a final word from the excellent Toni Reavis. I'm Harry Morgan, and this is JOG ON.
There's an integrity to it. There's an honor to it. It's a sport that you want to be around for the people. No matter what else you don't have in common with someone, if they run and you run with them, especially if you run hard, you know that person. You know something deep about that person. Because if I feel the way I feel, then that person's got to feel something like this. Americans have sports that we play. Well, running is a sport that the world plays.